I was fixing the kitchen chair when my son-in-law snatched the screwdriver from my hand. "You're too slow even for this, old man," he yelled. My daughter just turned her face away, pretending not to see. 5 minutes later, the sound of splintering wood made her run back, and she froze when she saw what I'd done. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought a simple kitchen chair would change everything." At 62, I had grown accustomed to the small humiliations that had become part of my daily routine. Stanley, my son-in-law, had a way of making me feel invisible in my own home, and my daughter Nora had perfected the art of looking the other way. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the chair finally gave out. The wooden leg had been wobbling for weeks, but every time I mentioned it, Stanley would roll his eyes and mutter something about how I complained about everything. So I decided to fix it myself. How hard could it be? I had been fixing things long before Stanley came into our lives 5 years ago. I gathered my tools from the garage, a screwdriver, some wood glue, a small clamp. Nothing fancy, just the basics I had used countless times over the years. The kitchen was quiet except for the distant sound of Nora's television from the living room. Stanley was supposed to be job hunting again, though I suspected he was actually playing games on his phone. I turned the chair upside down and examined the loose joint. The screws had worked themselves free over time, creating a gap that needed to be filled and reinforced. I applied a thin line of wood glue to the joint and began working the screwdriver, trying to tighten the connection without stripping the old wood. That's when I heard his heavy footsteps on the kitchen tile. "What the hell are you doing now?" Stanley's voice cut through the peaceful silence like a knife. I looked up to see him standing in the doorway, his thick arms crossed over his chest, that familiar sneer already forming on his lips. "Just fixing the chair," I said quietly, turning my attention back to the screw. The leg was loose. "You're doing it wrong." He stepped closer and I could smell the stale beer on his breath, even though it was only 2 in the afternoon. "You're supposed to clamp it first, then add the glue." "Jesus, don't you know anything about woodworking?" I continued working, trying to ignore him. "I've been fixing furniture since before you were born, Stanley." That was apparently the wrong thing to say. His face darkened and he took another step toward me. "Yeah, well, maybe that's the problem. Maybe you're too old to remember how to do anything right anymore." My hands trembled slightly as I tried to maintain my grip on the screwdriver. The screw was almost tight enough, just needed a few more turns. But Stanley wasn't finished. "Look at you, shaking like a leaf. You can't even hold a simple tool steady." His voice was getting louder now, that cruel edge that always appeared when he sensed weakness. "No wonder everything around here falls apart. You're too slow even for this, old man." Before I could react, his large hand shot out and grabbed the screwdriver from my grip, yanking it away with such force that I nearly lost my balance. The sudden movement sent a shock of pain through my arthritic fingers, but it wasn't the physical pain that hurt the most. "Stanley!" I called out, louder than I intended. "I was using that." "Not anymore," he said, examining the screwdriver like it was some precious artifact I had been mishandling. "I'll fix it properly, the way it should be done." I stood there for a moment, my empty hand still curved around the ghost of the tool he had snatched away. The humiliation burned in my chest, a familiar weight that had been growing heavier with each passing month. This wasn't the first time Stanley had treated me like a foolish child in my own home, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the way he had grabbed the tool, like I had no right to touch anything in my own house. Maybe it was the casual cruelty in his voice, the assumption that he could simply take whatever he wanted from me without consequence. Or maybe it was the sound of Nora's footsteps retreating from the kitchen doorway. I turned and caught a glimpse of her disappearing back down the hallway. She had been there. She had seen everything, and she had chosen to walk away rather than say a word in my defense. My daughter, who I had raised alone after her mother died. My daughter, who I had worked 2 jobs to put through college. My daughter, who had once looked at me like I could fix anything in the world. She had watched her husband humiliate me and decided it wasn't worth her time to intervene. Stanley was crouched over the chair now, working with exaggerated precision to show me how it should really be done. "See, you clamp it here first," he was saying, his voice dripping with condescension. "Then you apply the glue evenly, not just glob it on like you were doing." I stood behind him, watching his thick fingers manipulate my tools, feeling something cold and hard settling in my stomach. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in around me. The afternoon light streaming through the window seemed dimmer somehow, casting everything in shadow. "You got that, Ken?" Stanley looked up at me with that smirk I had learned to hate. "Next time maybe you should ask for help instead of making things worse." I nodded slowly, but I wasn't really listening anymore. My attention was focused on a loose piece of wooden molding near the kitchen counter, a small strip that had been bothering me for weeks. It was barely hanging on, held in place by just one nail. Without really thinking about it, I reached out and grasped the molding with both hands. "Kenneth?" Nora's voice came from down the hall. "Is everything okay in there?" I looked at Stanley, still crouched over my chair with my tools, treating me like an incompetent stranger in my own kitchen. I thought about all the times he had spoken to me this way, all the times Nora had pretended not to see, all the small deaths I had endured in silence. Then I pulled. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. The molding came free with such violence that it sent wood chips flying across the room. Stanley jumped back, startled, nearly dropping my screwdriver. "What the hell?" he started to say, but the words died in his throat when he saw my face. I was still holding the broken piece of wood, my knuckles white with tension. Something had shifted in my expression, something that made Stanley take an unconscious step backward. For the first time since I had known him, I saw uncertainty flicker across his features. Nora's running footsteps echoed through the hallway, growing louder as she rushed back toward the kitchen. But I didn't look away from Stanley. I stood there holding that piece of broken wood, feeling something wake up inside me that had been sleeping for far too long. When Nora appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with alarm, she froze completely. Not because of the broken molding or the scattered wood chips. She froze because she saw something in her father's eyes that she had never seen before. The silence in the kitchen stretched on forever. Nora stood frozen in the doorway, her mouth slightly open, staring at me like she had never seen me before. Stanley had backed himself against the counter, his eyes darting between the splintered wood in my hands and my face. For 5 long seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Stanley cleared his throat and tried to reclaim his authority. "Jesus, Ken, what's gotten into you? You nearly gave me a heart attack." His voice was attempting its usual condescending tone, but there was something else underneath it now, something that sounded almost like caution. I set the broken molding down on the counter with deliberate care, my movements slow and controlled. "Sorry," I said quietly. "It was already loose. I guess I pulled too hard." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. And somehow I suspected they knew it too. Nora was still staring at me with that strange expression, like she was trying to solve a puzzle. "Dad, are you feeling all right? You look—" "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said, turning to meet her gaze. "Just frustrated with myself for being so clumsy." She didn't look convinced, but she nodded anyway. Stanley had already returned his attention to the chair, but I noticed he kept glancing up at me every few seconds, as if making sure I was still the harmless old man he thought he knew. If only he knew the truth. As they left the kitchen, Stanley muttering about cleaning up my mess and Nora following him like a loyal shadow, I found myself alone with my thoughts and the scattered wood chips on the floor. I bent down slowly, my knees protesting, and began gathering the pieces. But my mind was somewhere else entirely. I was thinking about the man I used to be, before Linda died, before loneliness made me grateful for any family connection, even one that slowly poisoned me with small cruelties. I used to manage a construction crew of 20 men, hard men who respected strength and had no patience for weakness. I had earned their respect not through fear or intimidation, but through competence and fairness. When I spoke, they listened. When I made a decision, they followed it. Those men would never have recognized the person I had become in this house. Linda's death 12 years ago had broken something fundamental inside me. Not just my heart, though, that had shattered into pieces I was still finding in dark corners of my memory. It had broken my sense of who I was supposed to be. Without her steady presence beside me, I had gradually shrunk into myself, becoming smaller and quieter with each passing month. When Nora started bringing Stanley around 3 years later, I was still deep in that fog of grief and self-doubt. I was so grateful to see my daughter happy again, so desperate not to be alone, that I overlooked the early warning signs, The way Stanley would interrupt me mid-sentence. The way he would rearrange my furniture without asking. The way he gradually positioned himself as the man of the house while treating me like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. By the time they married 2 years ago, the pattern was set. I had become the old man who shuffled around the edges of his own life, grateful for whatever scraps of respect Stanley chose to throw my way. But that piece of molding hadn't been loose. Not really. I had tested it that morning while Stanley was still sleeping off his usual hangover. It was solid, held firmly in place by 3 sturdy nails. It would have taken considerable force to remove it without tools. The kind of force that comes from 20 years of swinging hammers and handling heavy equipment. The kind of force that still lived in these old hands, even if I had forgotten it was there. I had pulled that molding free deliberately, with the same precision I once used to demolish walls that needed to come down. It had been a test. A small experiment to see what would happen if Kenneth Matthews showed even a glimpse of the strength he had spent 5 years carefully hiding. And the results had been interesting. Stanley's reaction told me everything I needed to know. Underneath all his bluster and casual cruelty, he was afraid of me. Not afraid of what I might do. He didn't think I was capable of anything threatening. He was afraid of who I might remember I used to be. Bullies always are. As for Nora, her reaction had been even more telling. She hadn't rushed to check if I was hurt or asked what had upset me. She had looked at me with something that might have been recognition, as if she had caught a glimpse of someone she thought was gone forever. That night, after Stanley had fallen asleep in front of the television and Nora had retreated to their bedroom, I sat in my small study looking through old photographs. There was one I particularly wanted to find, taken about 15 years ago at a company barbecue. I found it tucked between the pages of an old address book. In the photo, I was standing with my crew after we had finished a particularly challenging project ahead of schedule. My arms were crossed, my shoulders straight, and I was smiling with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his worth. I barely recognized him, but as I studied that photograph, feeling the ghost of old certainties stirring in my chest, I began to understand something important. That man wasn't really gone. He had just been sleeping, buried under layers of grief and loneliness and the desire to keep peace at any cost. The incident with the molding had been more than just a moment of anger. It had been an awakening, a reminder that I was not, by nature, a man who accepted disrespect quietly. I closed the photo album and walked to my bedroom window, looking out at the street where I had lived for 38 years. Tomorrow, Stanley would probably treat me the same way he always had. He would take my tools, mock my efforts, and speak to me like I was a burden he graciously tolerated. But something fundamental had changed this afternoon. Some line had been crossed that I hadn't even known existed. I thought about the look of uncertainty in Stanley's eyes when he saw my face after the molding splintered. I thought about Nora's confused stare as if she was seeing a stranger wearing her father's clothes. Maybe it was time they met the real Kenneth Matthews. The man who had built things that lasted, who had commanded respect without demanding it, who had never backed down from a challenge worth fighting. The man who was getting very tired of being treated like a ghost in his own home. As I prepared for bed, I found myself looking forward to tomorrow for the first time in months. Not because I expected things to magically improve, but because I was beginning to remember what it felt like to stop accepting things I didn't have to accept. The broken molding was just the beginning. 3 days after the kitchen incident, I started paying attention in ways I hadn't for years. Real attention. The kind that comes from understanding that something important is happening, even if you can't yet see the full picture. Stanley had been different since Tuesday, not dramatically so. He still treated me with the same casual disrespect he always had, but there was something new in his behavior, a heightened alertness when I was around, as if he was watching for signs of whatever he had glimpsed in my face that afternoon. It was Friday evening when I discovered just how much I had been missing. I was in my study, supposedly reading, but actually listening to the conversation taking place in the living room. Nora and Stanley were discussing finances, something they usually did behind their closed bedroom door. But tonight, perhaps because they thought I was engrossed in my book, they were speaking freely. The property tax bill came today, Nora was saying, and I could hear the stress in her voice. $4,200. Dad usually handles it, but... But what? Stanley's voice carried that edge of impatience that appeared whenever Nora showed signs of independent thinking. I don't know if we should just assume he'll pay it again. Maybe we should talk to him about it first. Stanley's laugh was sharp and humorless. Talk to him? Nora, your father lives here rent-free. The least he can do is cover the property taxes on his own house. I set my book down carefully, my pulse beginning to quicken. My own house? It's not really his house anymore, though, is it? Nora's voice was quiet, uncertain. I mean, legally. Legally, it's ours now. You're his only heir, and we're married. Community property, remember? We discussed this when we did the paperwork. What paperwork? I rose from my chair as quietly as possible and moved closer to the study door, which I had left slightly ajar. My heart was beating so hard I was afraid they might hear it. I know, but he still thinks… Nora started. He thinks what he needs to think. Stanley interrupted. Look, baby, I know this is hard for you. He's your dad, but you have to face reality. He's getting older, more confused. Did you see what happened with that molding on Tuesday? Random violence like that, it's not normal. Random violence. That's what he was calling it. That wasn't violence, Stanley. He just pulled too hard. Was it? Because from where I was standing it looked like an old man having some kind of episode. And frankly, it's only going to get worse. I pressed my back against the wall, struggling to process what I was hearing. They had done paperwork. Legal paperwork that somehow transferred ownership of my house. When? How had they managed that without my knowledge? You're scaring me, Nora whispered. I'm not trying to scare you, sweetheart. I'm trying to prepare you. Your father is showing signs of dementia. The confusion, the sudden outburst, the way he sometimes just stares off into space. We need to start thinking about what comes next. Dementia. The word hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't confused. I wasn't having episodes. I was just tired of being treated like furniture in my own home. But somehow Stanley had convinced my daughter that my growing frustration was a symptom of mental decline. Maybe we should get him evaluated, Nora said, her voice growing stronger. You know, by a professional. We will when the time is right, but for now we just need to be patient with him. Let him feel like he's still in control while we handle the important decisions. Let him feel like he's still in control. I closed my eyes and leaned against the wall, finally understanding the full scope of what had been happening to me. This wasn't just casual disrespect or the natural friction that comes from multiple generations living under one roof. This was a systematic campaign to undermine my competence and independence. Stanley continued talking, his voice taking on the tone he used when he was explaining something obvious to someone he considered slow. The key is to manage the transition gradually. Keep him comfortable, keep him feeling useful, but make sure all the real decisions go through us. Eventually, when he's ready, we can start looking at assisted living options. Assisted living? They were planning to put me in a nursing home. He's only 62, Stanley. That seems premature. Age is just a number, baby. It's a mental capacity that matters. And honestly, between you and me, I think he's been declining for longer than we realized. Remember last month when he couldn't find his reading glasses? They were on his head the whole time. I remembered that day. I had been looking for my glasses while Stanley monopolized the bathroom for 45 minutes. When I finally mentioned I couldn't find them, he had pointed out they were on my head and made a big show of being concerned about my memory issues. At the time I had been embarrassed. Now I realized it had been deliberate. Or what about when he put salt in his coffee instead of sugar? Stanley went on. Normal people don't make mistakes like that. That hadn't been a mistake either. Stanley had been using my usual coffee mug, so I had grabbed a different one from the cabinet. In the dim morning light, I had reached for what I thought was the sugar bowl, but was actually the salt shaker. It was the kind of simple error anyone might make in a poorly lit kitchen. But Stanley had treated it like evidence of cognitive decline. How many other innocent mistakes had he catalogued as symptoms? How long had he been building this case against my mental competence? I just worry that we're moving too fast, Nora said, but her voice lacked conviction. She wanted to be convinced. We're not moving at all yet, sweetheart. We're just being prepared. And honestly, it might be better for him too. He seems so lost lately, so frustrated. Maybe having fewer responsibilities would actually make him happier. The conversation continued, but I had heard enough. I made my way back to my chair on unsteady legs, my mind reeling with implications I was only beginning to grasp. They had somehow transferred ownership of my house. They were portraying my normal human mistakes as signs of dementia. They were planning my future without my input, discussing me like I was a problem to be managed rather than a person with rights and preferences. And worst of all, Nora was going along with it. I sat in my study for another hour, staring at the same page of my book while my thoughts churned. Finally, I heard their conversation end and their footsteps heading toward the bedroom. I waited until the house was completely quiet before making my move. My computer was in the study, an old desktop machine that I used mainly for email and reading news. It took several minutes to boot up, but eventually I was able to access my online banking account. What I found there made my blood run cold. My checking account, which should have had about $12,000, showed a balance of $347. My savings account was completely empty. The certificates of deposit that represented my retirement security were gone. But it was the transaction history that truly horrified me. Regular transfers to an account I didn't recognize. Large withdrawals with explanations like household expenses and medical costs. Payments to companies I had never heard of for services I had never authorized. The thefts went back 18 months. They had been stealing from me systematically, gradually, probably hoping I wouldn't notice until it was too late to do anything about it. My hands shook as I scrolled through page after page of unauthorized transactions. Tens of thousands of dollars. Gone. Money I had saved over decades of hard work, money that was supposed to ensure my independence in my later years, had been quietly siphoned away while Stanley convinced my daughter I was losing my mind. I was about to close the browser when I noticed something else. A pending transaction scheduled for Monday morning. A withdrawal of $5,000 with a notation that simply read, SR, personal loan. Stanley Ray. Even his initials made me sick. I printed out 12 months' worth of bank statements, taking care to keep the printer noise as quiet as possible. Then I cleared the browser history and shut down the computer. As I sat there in the dark, holding the evidence of their betrayal, I felt something cold and hard settling in my chest. This wasn't just about disrespect anymore. This was theft. This was fraud. This was my own daughter helping her husband steal my future. But more than that, it was about Stanley's long-term plan finally becoming clear. He wasn't just trying to humiliate me or push me to the margins of my own life. He was systematically destroying my independence so that I would have no choice but to accept whatever living arrangements they decided were best for me. The broken molding had been my first glimpse of the man I used to be. Now, holding proof of their crimes in my hands, I felt that man fully awakening. Kenneth Matthews had spent 5 years being the perfect victim. But Kenneth Matthews had also spent 20 years managing construction projects, dealing with difficult personalities and solving complex problems. It was time to remember which of those skill sets would serve me better. Saturday morning came too early and too bright. I had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling and trying to decide how to handle what I had discovered. The bank statements were hidden in my study, but their contents burned in my memory like acid. Stanley left early, claiming he had job interviews lined up, though I suspected he was meeting with whoever was helping him launder my money. This gave me the opportunity I needed to talk to Nora alone. I found her in the kitchen, still in her bathrobe, nursing a cup of coffee and scrolling through her phone. For a moment, looking at her profile in the morning light, I could see traces of the little girl who used to climb into my lap and ask me to read her stories. That little girl would have been horrified by what her adult self was doing to me. "Morning, Dad," she said without looking up from her screen. "There's coffee in the pot if you want some." "Actually, honey, I was hoping we could talk." I kept my voice casual, non-threatening. "Just the two of us." Something in my tone made her look up. "Is everything okay?" I poured myself a cup of coffee, using the time to choose my words carefully. "I've been thinking about some things, and I need to ask you a few questions." She set her phone down, suddenly alert. "What kind of questions?" I sat across from her at the table, the same table where we used to do her homework together, where I had helped her prepare for job interviews, where I had given her advice about dating and college and all the important decisions of her young adult life. "Last night I heard you and Stanley discussing property taxes," I began. Her face went pale. Dad, we weren't trying to hide anything from you. It's just that the bill came and we weren't sure. Nora, I interrupted gently. When did you put the house in your name? The silence that followed was deafening. She stared at me like I had just asked her to explain quantum physics, her mouth opening and closing without sound. What do you mean? I mean, when did we transfer the deed? Because I don't remember signing any paperwork, and I would remember something that important. Her hands began to tremble around her coffee cup. Dad, you did sign papers. Last year, after your birthday. You said you wanted to make sure everything was taken care of if something happened to you. What papers specifically? The estate planning documents. Stanley found a lawyer who specialized in elder care, and he said it would be smart to get everything organized while you could still make decisions clearly. While I could still make decisions clearly. The implication was crystal clear. And you believed I needed help making decisions clearly? No, not exactly. It's just, Dad, you've been so sad since Mom died, and sometimes you seem confused about things, and Stanley thought what exactly? Her voice became smaller. That maybe it would be easier for everyone if the legal stuff was already handled, so you wouldn't have to worry about it. I set my coffee down with deliberate care. Nora, I need you to look at me and tell me the truth. Do you really think I'm losing my mental capacity? She couldn't meet my eyes. Sometimes you do things that worry me. Like what? Like Tuesday with the molding. That was so random and violent, Dad. It scared me. I pulled a loose piece of wood off the wall because it was bothering me. How is that violent? But the way you looked afterward. Like you were angry about something. And you've been so withdrawn lately. So quiet. Stanley says that's often how it starts. Stanley says. Everything came back to what Stanley said, what Stanley thought, what Stanley recommended. What else has Stanley told you about my condition? She shifted uncomfortably. It's not like that, Dad. He's just been watching out for you. For both of us. By stealing my money? The words hung in the air between us like a physical barrier. Nora's face went completely white, and for a moment I thought she might faint. What are you talking about? She whispered. I pulled the bank statements from my shirt pocket and placed them on the table between us. I checked my accounts last night, honey. Everything's gone. Decades of savings wiped out by someone with access to my banking information. She stared at the papers but didn't touch them. Dad, that's impossible. We would never... Look at them, Nora. I don't need to look at anything. You're confused about something, and Stanley can explain. Stanley can explain why there's a $5,000 withdrawal scheduled for Monday morning with his initials on it. Her hand flew to her mouth. Oh, God. Did you know, honey? Did you know he was stealing from me? Tears started flowing down her cheeks, but she shook her head frantically. No, Dad, it's not stealing. It's just, we've been handling your finances because you weren't paying attention to them anymore. You stopped opening bills, stopped balancing your checkbook. We were trying to help. By emptying my accounts? By taking care of things you couldn't take care of yourself. Her voice rose to a near shout. Dad, you haven't paid a bill in 2 years. You haven't even looked at your bank statements. We've been keeping this household running while you just exist. I felt like she had slapped me. I exist. Is that what you think I've been doing? What else would you call it? You shuffle around here like a ghost. You never talk to us unless we talk to you first. You spend all your time in that study, reading the same books over and over. Stanley says you're depressed on top of everything else. Stanley says a lot of things. Because Stanley cares about you. About us. He's the one who noticed you were having problems. He's the one who suggested we get help. He's the one who found the lawyer and set up the estate planning and took over the finances because you couldn't handle them anymore. I stared at my daughter, this woman I had raised and loved and sacrificed for, and realized that somewhere along the way I had completely lost her. Stanley had poisoned her against me so thoroughly that she genuinely believed stealing my money was an act of kindness. Nora, I said quietly, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am not confused. I am not losing my memory. I am not incompetent. I have been quiet and sad, yes, because I miss your mother and because I've been lonely. But that doesn't mean I can't take care of myself." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Dad, I know you think that, but..." "But what? But Stanley has convinced you otherwise? Stanley loves this family. Stanley loves my money, and apparently he loves having a place to live rent-free while he systematically steals everything I've worked for." "That's not true." "Then explain the bank statements, Nora. Explain 18 months of unauthorized withdrawals. Explain how my retirement savings disappeared while I was supposedly too incompetent to notice." She looked down at the papers again, her hands shaking. "There has to be an explanation." "There is an explanation. Your husband is a thief and he's been using you to help him steal from me." "Stop it," she cried, standing up so quickly her chair nearly fell over. "Just stop it. Stanley is a good man who's been trying to help us. He's been patient with you even when you've been difficult and stubborn and..." "And what, Nora? What have I done that's been so difficult?" "You question everything he does. You act like he doesn't belong here. You make him feel unwelcome in his own home." "His own home?" "Our home. Mine and Stanley's home. You're the one living here as our guest, Dad, not the other way around." The words hit me like physical blows. This wasn't just about money or respect. This was about my daughter choosing her husband over her father so completely that she had rewritten our entire history. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 62 years in my bones. "I see." Something in my tone made her step back. "Dad, I didn't mean..." "Yes, you did. And I'm glad you said it, because now I understand where we stand." "Where we stand?" "You've made your choice, honey. You've chosen to believe that I'm incompetent, that I'm a burden, that I'm a guest in my own home. You've chosen to side with a man who's been systematically stealing from me and planning to put me in a nursing home. That's not... We're not... And I've made my choice too." I picked up the bank statements and folded them carefully. "I'm going to get my money back, Nora, all of it. And I'm going to make sure Stanley faces consequences for what he's done." "Dad, please, let's just talk to Stanley when he gets home. I'm sure he can explain..." "I don't want his explanations. I want my life back." I headed toward the door, then paused and looked back at her. She was crying again, her hands pressed against her face, looking young and lost and frightened. For a moment my heart almost softened. This was still my daughter, still the little girl I had loved and protected and guided through childhood. But then I remembered her words. "You're the one living here as our guest." "I love you, Nora," I said quietly, "but I won't let you destroy me to save your marriage." As I walked out of the kitchen, I could hear her sobbing behind me. It broke my heart, but it didn't change my mind. Kenneth Matthews had spent 5 years being the perfect victim, accepting insults and theft and manipulation because he was afraid of being alone. But being alone was better than being devoured. Monday morning, I was waiting in the bank parking lot when they opened at 9 o'clock. I had spent the weekend researching, planning and preparing for what needed to happen next. The old Kenneth Matthews might have confronted Stanley directly, demanding explanations and hoping for remorse. But the man I was becoming understood that predators like Stanley only respond to superior force. The bank manager, Mrs. Chen, remembered me from my construction days. I had done the renovation work on their downtown branch 7 years ago, and she greeted me warmly when I explained I needed help with what appeared to be fraudulent activity on my accounts. "Mr. Matthews, I'm so sorry this has happened," she said, reviewing the statements I had brought. "This type of elder financial abuse is unfortunately becoming more common." Elder financial abuse. The phrase stung, but it was accurate. What are my options? "Well, first we need to freeze all your accounts immediately to prevent any further unauthorized access. Then we'll need to file a police report and begin the process of documenting every fraudulent transaction." "How long will that take?" "The investigation could take several months, but we can expedite the process if you have clear evidence of who was responsible." She looked at me carefully. "Do you know who has been accessing your accounts?" I nodded. "My son-in-law, and possibly my daughter." Her expression grew sympathetic but professional. "I understand this must be very difficult for you. Do you have somewhere safe to stay while this gets sorted out?" That was a question I hadn't fully considered. Legally, the house might be in Nora's name now, but I wasn't about to be driven from my home by a thief and his accomplice. "I'll figure something out." By Tuesday afternoon, I had filed the police report and opened new accounts that Stanley couldn't access. But I knew the legal system would move slowly, and I needed faster results. Stanley had spent years building his web of manipulation and theft. I couldn't afford to wait months for justice while he continued to destroy what was left of my life. That's when I remembered something from my construction days. When you're dealing with someone who cuts corners and lies about it, you don't just confront them with evidence. You create pressure from multiple directions until they make mistakes that expose everything. I started with Stanley's daily routine. He claimed to be job hunting, but I had noticed he left the house at the same time every day and returned exactly 4 hours later. That wasn't the schedule of someone going to interviews. That was the schedule of someone with a regular appointment. On Wednesday morning, I followed him. Stanley's routine led me to a strip mall 20 minutes from the house where he parked outside a place called Lucky's Gaming Parlor. I watched from across the street as he walked inside like he owned the place, greeting the security guard with the familiarity of a regular customer. I sat in my car for 3 hours, watching other men come and go. Young men, old men, men in expensive suits, and men in work clothes. All of them had the same hungry, desperate look in their eyes that I recognized from construction sites where workers would blow their paychecks on poker games during lunch breaks. Stanley was gambling, and based on how much money he had stolen from me, he was losing. When he finally emerged, I followed him to his next stop, a pawn shop called Quick Cash. He went inside carrying a small bag and came out empty-handed. Then he drove to a check-cashing place, then to another gaming parlor across town. By the time he headed home, I had a complete picture of Stanley's real daily routine. He wasn't looking for work. He was feeding an addiction that was consuming every dollar he could steal. That evening, I made a phone call to Lucky's Gaming Parlor. "I'm trying to reach Stanley Ray," I told the person who answered. "He left his wallet here yesterday." "Stanley? Yeah, he's here every morning. You want me to tell him you called?" "No, that's okay. I'll catch him tomorrow." "Does he usually stay until afternoon?" "Usually until his credit runs out." The voice laughed. "That boy's got a serious problem." "Perfect." Thursday morning, I made another call, this time to Stanley's cell phone. When he answered, I could hear the background noise of the gaming parlor. "Stanley, it's Ken. I need you to come home right away." "What? Why?" "I'm in the middle of something. There are 2 police officers here asking questions about fraudulent bank activity. They want to talk to you." The silence on the other end of the line was beautiful. "Police officers?" His voice had gone up an octave. "They have some kind of court order to search financial records. Nora's pretty upset. You should get home as soon as possible." "I'll be right there." I hung up and smiled. There were no police officers, of course, but Stanley's panicked reaction told me everything I needed to know about his guilty conscience. While Stanley was racing home to deal with imaginary police, I made my way to Lucky's Gaming Parlor. The security guard who had greeted Stanley so warmly was happy to chat with a concerned family member. "Stanley Ray? Oh yeah, that guy's in deep. He owes money all over town." The guard shook his head sympathetically. "Started small about 2 years ago, but it got out of hand fast. Now he's into some serious people for serious money." "How serious?" "Let's just say the kind of people who don't take no for an answer. He's been promising them a big payoff for months now. Something about an inheritance coming through." "An inheritance? My house, my savings, my life insurance?" Stanley had been using my assets as collateral for his gambling debts. "How much does he owe?" The guard looked around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "Word is it's somewhere around 30,000, maybe more." $30,000. That explained why the thefts from my accounts had been accelerating. Stanley wasn't just stealing to fund his gambling anymore. He was stealing to pay off dangerous people who were probably threatening him. And that gave me the leverage I needed. I spent the rest of Thursday gathering information. The pawn shop confirmed that Stanley had been selling items regularly. Jewelry, electronics, tools that I now realized had been taken from my house without my knowledge. The check-cashing place knew him as someone who frequently needed quick loans against future payments. By Friday morning, I had enough evidence to destroy Stanley completely, but I didn't want to destroy him. I wanted to control him. That's when I made the call I had been planning all week. "Is this Mario Castellano?" I asked when a gruff voice answered the phone. I had gotten the number from a construction contact who knew people in various industries around the city. Who wants to know? My name is Kenneth Matthews. I believe you have a business relationship with Stanley Ray. A pause. What kind of business? The kind where he owes you money and promises to pay it back with assets that don't actually belong to him. Another pause, longer this time. You got my attention. Stanley has been stealing from me to fund his gambling and pay his debts. I have documentation of everything, bank records, police reports, the whole story. I also have evidence that he's been using my property as collateral for loans he can't repay. So, what do you want? I want to make you a deal. Stanley owes you money he doesn't have, using assets he can't deliver. But I can make sure you get paid, and I can make sure Stanley learns a lesson he won't forget. I'm listening. Tomorrow night, Stanley's going to receive a visit from some people who are going to explain to him that his credit has run out. They're going to make it clear that he has 48 hours to pay everything he owes, or there will be consequences. And then he's going to come home and confess everything to his wife. He's going to beg for forgiveness and promise to get help. And when she asks how they're going to pay back the money, he's going to realize that he has no choice but to turn to the one person he's been robbing. Mario's laugh was not pleasant. You're a cold old man, Kenneth Matthews. I'm a man who's tired of being stolen from. Are we going to have a problem, or are we going to have a solution? We're going to have a solution, but this better work out the way you're saying. It will. Stanley is a coward and a bully. When he's scared enough, he'll do exactly what I need him to do. After I hung up, I sat in my study looking at the chess set I hadn't touched in years. Linda had bought it for me when I retired, hoping we could spend quiet evenings playing together. We had only managed a few games before the cancer took her away, but I remembered the lessons. The key to chess isn't having the strongest pieces. It's controlling the board and forcing your opponent to make moves that serve your strategy instead of theirs. Stanley thought he had been playing me for 5 years, but the game was just beginning, and this time I was the one moving the pieces. Saturday night, Stanley was going to discover what it felt like to be truly afraid. And Sunday morning, he was going to learn that sometimes the person you've been underestimating is the most dangerous opponent you could possibly face. Sunday morning came with the sound of Stanley's panicked voice echoing through the house. I was in my study, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, when his shouting pulled me from an article about local construction projects. Nora, we need to talk, right now. I set down my coffee and listened as footsteps thundered down the hallway. Nora's sleepy voice responded from their bedroom, confused and alarmed. Stanley, what's wrong? What time is it? Get up. We have a serious problem. I had been waiting for this moment since Saturday night, when Stanley's gambling creditors had apparently paid him the visit I had arranged. I hadn't seen him come home. He had arrived sometime after midnight, and from the sounds I heard through the walls, he had spent most of the night pacing and muttering to himself. Now it seemed he was ready to have the conversation I had been planning for him. I moved closer to my study door, positioning myself where I could hear everything clearly. Nora's voice was growing more awake and more worried. Stanley, you're scaring me. What happened? His voice cracked. I made some mistakes, baby. Bad mistakes, and now we're in trouble. What kind of mistakes? There was a long pause, and when Stanley spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I owe money. A lot of money. To people who don't accept excuses. How much money? $32,000. I heard Nora gasp, then a moment of stunned silence. When she spoke again, her voice was hollow. 32,000. Stanley, where did you get $32,000 to lose? I borrowed it. Against the house, against your dad's accounts, against everything I could use as collateral. I thought I could win it back, but you used Dad's money. I used our money. Money that was sitting there doing nothing while we struggled to pay bills. Our money? Nora's voice was rising now. Stanley's, that wasn't our money. That was Dad's retirement savings. Your dad doesn't need retirement savings. He's got you to take care of him. But we needed that money to live, to get ahead, to build something for ourselves. I heard footsteps moving rapidly across the floor, then the sound of Nora's voice, tight with panic. Oh my God, Stanley. Oh my God. How could you do this? I was trying to help us. I was trying to make things better. By stealing from my father? by using resources that were available. Look, it doesn't matter how it happened. What matters is that we fix it. These people, Nora, they're not going to wait much longer. They made that very clear last night." There was another pause, and I could picture Nora trying to process what she was hearing. "What did they do to you?" "They didn't hurt me, not yet, but they will if I don't pay them back by Tuesday." "Tuesday? That's 2 days." "I know. That's why we need to think fast. We need to get the money somehow." "How, Stanley? Where are we supposed to get $32,000 in 2 days?" "You're dead." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. When Nora finally responded, her voice was deadly quiet. "Am I dead? The man whose money you stole. You want me to ask him for more money?" "He doesn't know about the gambling. We can tell him it's for medical expenses or home repairs or—" "Stanley, stop. Just stop talking." I heard movement again, then the sound of a door slamming. Stanley's voice called after her, desperate and wheedling. "Nora, wait. We can work this out. We just need to be smart about it." But apparently Nora was done listening, because the next sound I heard was her footsteps coming down the hallway toward my study. She knocked on my door, and when I opened it, she looked like she had aged 10 years overnight. Her eyes were red and swollen, her hair disheveled, her hands shaking. "Dad, can we talk?" I stepped aside to let her in, then closed the door behind her. She sat in the chair across from my desk and buried her face in her hands. "He told you?" I asked gently. She looked up, startled. "You knew?" "I suspected. The gambling, the debts, the desperation. It explained a lot about his behavior." "Why didn't you say anything?" I sat back down at my desk, studying my daughter's face. "Would you have believed me?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Probably not. Stanley needed to tell you himself. Otherwise it would have just been my word against his, and we both know whose side you would have taken." Fresh tears started flowing down her cheeks. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I believed everything he told me about you, about your condition, about the financial arrangements. I thought we were helping you." "I know. He said you were becoming incompetent, that you couldn't handle your own affairs anymore. He made it seem like taking over your finances was the responsible thing to do. And you wanted to believe him because it made the theft feel justified." She flinched at the word theft, but she didn't argue. "What are we going to do? These people he owes money to, they sounded really dangerous." I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out a folder containing all the documentation I had gathered over the past week. Bank records, police reports, evidence of Stanley's gambling addiction, and proof of his debts to various creditors. "We are going to do nothing, honey. Stanley is going to face the consequences of his choices." "But if he doesn't pay them back?" "He will. Because I'm going to give him exactly one option to save himself." Nora stared at the folder in my hands. "What option?" "He's going to confess everything to the police. He's going to plead guilty to elder fraud and theft. He's going to serve whatever sentence the judge gives him, and in exchange I will pay off his gambling debts so that he lives long enough to serve that sentence." "Dad, you can't. You don't have that kind of money anymore." I smiled, and for the first time in days it was a genuinely warm smile. "Actually, I do. The bank froze all my accounts on Monday, but they also initiated recovery procedures for fraudulent transactions. I'll get most of my money back eventually. In the meantime, I have resources Stanley doesn't know about." "What resources?" 20 years of construction work builds relationships, honey. I have friends who owe me favors, former employees who remember when I helped them out of tough spots, business contacts who trust my word. I made some calls this week." I opened the folder and showed her a bank statement from an account Stanley had never known existed. "This is money I set aside years ago for emergencies. Money your mother and I agreed should never be touched unless the situation was truly desperate." Nora stared at the numbers. $50,000? Enough to pay Stanley's debts and cover the legal fees for prosecuting him. She was quiet for several minutes, processing everything. Finally, she looked up at me with something that looked like respect. "You planned all of this, didn't you? The confrontations, the pressure on Stanley, getting him to confess to me instead of continuing to lie. I planned to take back control of my life. Everything else was just strategy." "Are you really going to have him arrested?" I considered the question carefully. "That depends on Stanley. If he agrees to certain conditions, we might be able to handle this privately. But there will be consequences either way. At that moment, we heard Stanley's voice calling from the living room. Nora, Kenneth, we need to talk, all three of us. Nora looked at me questioningly. I nodded and stood up. Let's go see what he has to say for himself. Stanley was pacing in the living room like a caged animal when we arrived. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair uncombed, and there was a desperate look in his eyes that I had never seen before. Kenneth, he said, attempting a conciliatory tone that fooled neither of us. I know this is awkward, but we need to discuss our situation like adults. Our situation? I raised an eyebrow. I wasn't aware I had a gambling problem. His face reddened. Look, I made some mistakes, okay? But we're family, and family helps each other out of tough spots. Family. I sat down in my favorite chair, the one Stanley had been trying to replace for months. Is that what we are? Of course, and right now I need your help. These people I owe money to, they are not reasonable people. If I don't pay them by Tuesday, you'll face the consequences of your choices. Stanley's mask of civility slipped completely. Don't give me that self-righteous bullshit, old man. I use money that was just sitting there gathering dust. Money you never even looked at. Money you stole. Money I invested in our future. I laughed, and the sound made Stanley step back. Stanley, you gambled away $32,000 of my retirement savings to feed an addiction. That's not investing, that's theft. I can pay it back. If you just loan me enough to cover the debt, I can get back on track. I've learned my lesson. Have you? Because yesterday you were still at Lucky's gaming parlor, trying to win back money you couldn't afford to lose. Stanley's face went white. How do you... I know everything, Stanley. Where you go, what you do, who you owe money to, and how much trouble you're really in. I also know that you've been using my assets as collateral for loans you can't repay. I stood up and moved closer to him, gratified to see him instinctively step back. Here's what's going to happen. You have two choices. Option 1, you pack your belongings and leave this house immediately. You never contact Nora again, you never come back here, and you deal with your creditors on your own. I can't do that. They'll kill me. Option 2. You turn yourself in to the police for elder fraud and theft. You plead guilty. You serve whatever sentence they give you, and I will pay off your gambling debts, so you survive long enough to do your time. Stanley looked desperately at Nora. Baby, you can't let him do this to me. We're married. We're supposed to stand by each other. Nora's voice was steady when she answered. You should have thought about that before you stole from my father and lied to me about it. I didn't lie. I managed things differently than you understood. You told me he was incompetent, so I wouldn't question what you were doing with his money. You made me believe my father was losing his mind to cover up your theft. That's not management, Stanley. That's fraud. I watched Stanley's face as he realized he had lost. No more manipulation, no more excuses, no more ways to charm his way out of the consequences. Fine, he said finally. I'll take option 1, I'll leave. No, I said calmly. You forfeited that choice when you involved my daughter in your crimes. You turned her into an unwitting accomplice, and you made her doubt her own father's competence. Option 1 is no longer available. You can't force me to confess to anything. I can't force you to do anything, but Tuesday morning your creditors are expecting payment. If they don't receive it, you'll have bigger problems than criminal charges. At least in prison you'll be safe from people who break kneecaps for a living. Stanley stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him weighing his limited options. Finally his shoulders sagged in defeat. What exactly are you asking me to confess to? Elder financial abuse? Theft by conversion? Fraud? Whatever charges the district attorney thinks are appropriate based on the evidence. And you'll really pay off the gambling debts? Once you're formally charged and in custody, yes. I keep my word, Stanley. It's something you might want to try. 3 hours later, we were sitting in a police station while Stanley gave his statement to a detective who specialized in financial crimes against elderly victims. Nora sat beside me, holding my hand for the first time in years. Dad, she said quietly while we waited for the paperwork to be completed. Yes, honey. I know sorry isn't enough, but I need to say it anyway. I'm sorry I didn't believe in you. I'm sorry I let him convince me you were losing your abilities. I'm sorry I chose him over you. I squeezed her hand gently. You chose what seemed like the truth at the time. Stanley is very good at making lies sound reasonable. What happens now? I mean, after all this is over? I considered the question carefully. Now you decide who you want to be going forward. The person who makes excuses for criminals, or the person who stands up for what's right. And us? Our relationship? That depends on you, honey. I love you, and that will never change. But I won't accept being treated like a burden or an inconvenience ever again. If we rebuild our relationship, it will be on the foundation of mutual respect. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I want that. I want to earn back your respect. Then we'll start there. That evening, I sat alone in my study for the first time in weeks without the weight of Stanley's presence poisoning the atmosphere. The house felt different, cleaner somehow, like a fever had finally broken. I pulled out the chess set and began arranging the pieces for a game I would probably play against myself. But for the first time since Linda's death, I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. The man I used to be wasn't gone. He had just been sleeping, waiting for the moment when strength was more important than peace. Now that he was awake, Kenneth Matthews was ready to live the rest of his life, on his own terms. And this time no one would ever mistake his kindness for weakness again.